Okay, happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to Patristicast. Today, I'm very honored and humbled to welcome Dr. John Rist onto the show. Dr. Rist is Emeritus Professor at the University of Toronto, I believe, philosophy, right? Or was it classics that you taught?
Both.
Okay. Ancient philosophy, patristics, ethics were some of your primary areas. You're a member of the Royal Society of Canada, which makes you the second member of that society to come on my show. And you're also, are you a member of the American Catholic Philosophical Association?
No, not now. I had been.
You had been. You were. You won an award, an acquaintance.
That's right. Yes, I did win an award in 2014. I think it was, or 15. I can't remember exactly when. That's right. Yes.
So you've done you spent a great deal of your professional career in North America, but you are in Cambridge right now, correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I spent 3 years in Scotland, but all the rest of the time, my academic career was in North America. Well, apart from 1 year I spent at the Hebrew University.
Ah, okay.
Oh, part of a year.
Okay. Are you familiar with Mara Niehoff?
With who?
Mara Niehoff?
No.
Oh, she works on Philo primarily in rabbinic Judaism. She was on my show. She was the most recent guest. We had a great conversation. Now, some of your major contributions for me personally is your work on Stoicism. And you were one of the earliest scholars to recognize the importance of Stoicism on Origen's thought.
Yes, I suppose so. Yes, I mean, some Germans had talked about that a fair amount, but not too much, and then not very precisely on the whole.
And Henry Chadwick, I think, of course, spoke a bit about that on Contra Calcium. But today, we're not going to talk about Origen or go into great detail on early Stoicism. We're going to talk about your most recent book, What is a Person? Realities, Constructs, and Illusions, published by Cambridge University Press. I thought perhaps the best way to open up the discussion on this book is to, I'm going to read a quote you have that kind of sets the stage for where we're at today. And then your book kind of traces how we got here and perhaps some solutions for how we can move forward and correct some of the wrongs I think you rightly perceive in current discussions of the human person. So here's the quote. There are in our contemporary Western society 2 very different accounts of, quote, persons. One Catholic Christian and comparatively stable and straightforward, though still incomplete. The other secularist and flexible, in that it is given to fixing some arbitrary criterion of personhood, and hence allows some apparent persons to be disqualified on grounds which vary according to the ideological assumptions or desires of the evaluators. So 2 primary views of the human person, one Catholic Christian, which you call the mainline tradition.
Yes, that's
and
right.
Other more secularist. How did you formulate that idea? What prompted you, I guess, to write about that issue today?
Well, I suppose it's been thought for a long time that there was a tradition, people sometimes call it the philosophy of perennis, which had grown up in Greek times and had developed down to the High Middle Ages, roughly, let's say, summed up something like by Aquinas. And then gradually that tradition, for various reasons, which were not always well understood, began to fall apart. People didn't know how to defend it. It was confronted with new problems which they didn't know how to solve. And so gradually, there were a series of effects which began to take place in the late Middle Ages. The most important one, in a way, I suppose, was that which led to the separation of theology from ethics. This seems to have begun, it began partly, I suppose, by the failure of the more traditional people like Aquinas to entirely reconcile the ideas they got from Greek philosophy with the ideas they got from the Christian tradition, largely handed down to them in some sort of Augustinian form. And this particularly arose over the question of the relationship between a good life and salvation. Gradually, these two features began to separate from one another. And of course, once that had happened, and once you started developing the notion of the good life entirely apart from traditional religion, you've broken away from the tradition, and you're trying to, therefore, you're compelled, therefore, to find new ways of defending positions which you otherwise would have had the support to defend, or at least, if not that, changing the goalposts, as it were, so that you give up the old ways of talking, for example, about persons eventually, replace them by new ones, and then try and see how far you can go with that. A very good, the best example of this way this sort of thing worked out in practice, I think, you can see perhaps in John Locke's attitude to rights, which I've talked about on a number of occasions. Essentially, the position now is that people who want to talk about rights theory in an entirely secular context essentially want Locke's conclusions without Locke's premise. Locke's premise being, of course, the existence of God. And that is extremely difficult thing to do. If you've lost that premise, you've got to find some other reason to do it. Now, this is really showing you, in effect, the difference between the two different sorts of traditions. One can answer this question, but it has to make metaphysical assumptions to do so, which many people now find unacceptable. The other tries to do so, and in fact, doesn't manage to do so. It still wants, as I say, Locke's conclusions without Locke's premises. I picked that example because, in a way, it represents very well the much bigger problem that I talked about both in what is a person and in other recent writings. Namely, what I'm really interested is why we are asking philosophically the kind of questions that we are now asking, particularly as it seems that many of these questions don't seem to be answerable. We assume we've got answers to them, but we haven't got the answers because the answers depended on a tradition which we've long since more or less abandoned. Rights theory then would be a perfect example of that. Faced with this situation that we're asking questions which we seem not to be able to answer and just therefore assume we know what the answer is, I've come to conclude the only way we can understand what's happened is to go back into the tradition and try and see exactly how we've got into this state of affairs. And if I'm right about this, what we've set for ourselves are a set of impossible questions, because we're trying to answer questions which we assume are literally sensible questions, but we're trying to answer them, as it were, basing ourselves on a whole series of different traditions, which you could sum up, so to speak, as they're not overall an alternative secular tradition, which are incompatible among themselves, as well as being incompatible with the original tradition, the earlier Philosophia Perennis, if you're going to call it that. So that's the setting, roughly, in which I've talked about this thing in What is Persons, and I've some of the more details about it I've worked out and published in more elaborate and often more technical terms in other writings, particularly in Augustine Deformed, where I've discussed a specific case of the history of notions of the relationship between loving and willing as it developed and, in my view, it became perverted in the post-medieval period.
You know, the problem that you're addressing in the book, I think you succinctly summarize in your introduction, but it's really two ways of looking at the human person, two different starting points. One is a religious starting point, and the other one is a very secularist starting point where God either doesn't exist or doesn't really matter. And you say, I think this is quite important what you say here. quote, "It might be argued that in a godless and soulless world, there is no true basis for moral obligation, since we live in a value-free universe, all values being human constructs, social constructs, and that newfangled ways of protecting persons, whoever they may be, cannot be intrinsically binding in that they can only be defended in conventional or at best prudential terms.
Yes.
And without God and soul, other possible ideas or realities about persons may have to be rethought or abandoned too. Spirit, for example, any concept of spiritual indicating not only religious but aesthetic values more potent than the products of mere sentimentality." So in the mainline tradition starts with reflections on the human person that assume the existence of a god or gods. And specifically in the Christian context, you make this point over and over again, which cannot be overstated. Genesis 1:26, God made in man's image, which a contemporary,
Man made in God's image.
a young conservative intellectual today in the United States by the name of Ben Shapiro says, he calls that the most important phrase in human history. And you say that is a vitally important verse for understanding the mainline tradition, and all moral obligation, virtue, understanding of the human person must start with that.
Yes. I think you can understand the remarks I made about value-free universe. If you look at one of the better expositors of what this really involves, that is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is a very realistic, sensible thinker. He's not sure whether God exists or not, but he's quite certain that if he does, he's got nothing to do with moral philosophy, politics, or anything of that kind. That means that there are all sorts of things which people chatter about, which you have to abandon if you want to accept the implications of that sort of world. Rights theory has to go right from the start. Hobbes, of course, entirely agrees with Bentham about that, another atheist who commented that rights are nonsense on stilts. Yeah. McIntyre has taken the same kind of view recently, quite rightly, implying, that is, of course, that they can't be defended outside of a religious context. You've also got to think about the basis of the claims you make for ordinary living without immediately introducing anything religious or metaphysical. All you can do in the actual world, as Hobbes puts it, is to act prudently, i.e. as rationally as you can, calculate your self-interest as well as you can to give you survival and what he calls a commodious life, which means that morality, in fact, is simply reduced to looking after yourself as rationally as you can. Mm-hmm. That seems to me to be the best exposition, and Hobbes, therefore, the best expositor of the kind of world which, if people look at it in blinkered fashion, that's the alternative to the religious position. It doesn't mean that they're true, either position. It doesn't mean that either of those positions are true, but that is the real alternative. Anything between the two is really an intellectual fudge. And whatever philosophers may want to say about that, they are finding some ways to engaging the fudging activity, because, as I say, they want the right results in their terms, but they're not willing to pay the right metaphysical or religious price to have them.
You make a very interesting observation in around the middle of your book. There's a historical phenomenon that happens that almost imposes itself on the way people thought about the human person. That is the discovery of the New World, globalization, commerce, and Hugo Grotius, you point out as a pivotal thinker in this regard. What impact did that discovery have on reflections of the human person? You make some very important points about that.
Well, if you read the writings of this period, say Montaigne, for example, obviously they were quite overwhelmed by realizing how much bigger the universe was, both our world and, of course, the wider universe as represented now by the discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo, and so on and so forth. everything had been expanded. And so one got the impression that somehow the older ways of talking about were built into a universe and indeed a world, which was no longer relevant almost. You've got to remember that in the earlier days, this sort of thing has been well discussed in a book by Robert Marcus called The End of Ancient Christianity, but it goes on much longer than the end of the ancient world. The world is very, very small. For most people, as it were, you live in your village, God's up there, not very far away, probably. The dead are down there, possibly. Anyway, the churchyard is down the bottom of the street. That's your universe almost. Most people lived in that kind of world, of course, unless they were in an army or something of that kind, or were taken off into slavery, let's say. But the world suddenly expanded. And not only expanded in terms of what we know about it, where we can go, but also tied in with this is a further discovery, that period, of course, the age of printing, which enables people to know an enormous amount more, and more people to know an enormous amount more, or think they know more about more than they had before. I think I may have commented there, I certainly have elsewhere, that even Henry VIII was unable in his early Catholic days to prevent England being deluged in a flood of Lutheran propaganda. That just shows how, from the point of view of the old world, things have just got out of control. You couldn't control it anymore. You could kill off a few people, whatever sort you didn't like, but it didn't make any real difference. In the end, people somehow sensed that the world is going to change. And once you start getting that sense to that degree, and for so many reasons, you will start thinking, well, the old ways of explaining the universe are out of date, basically, particularly when even those who like the old ways in many respects, let's say, for example, Thomas More or Erasmus, Colet in England, were very fed up with the traditional ways of teaching about the earlier tradition. They somehow felt that the whole thing had run into the sand, that the thinking of late in medieval times had just degenerated into triviality. There's a curious parallel in this, incidentally, to what I think happened in the 20th century, around about in the 50s when I was an undergraduate. At that time, quite a lot of people who thought of studying philosophy, including me actually at that point to some extent, looked at what was being read and written and thought, well, this is just banal, it's uninteresting, it's not going to answer any of the questions we want answered, we'll go and do something else. And a large number of them did. I think that mentality was very strong at the end of the Middle Ages, particularly among people who had some sort of more artistic sense. Already as far back as Petrarch, for example. Petrarch is already saying, long before, as it were, the end of the Middle Ages, that schools are dreary, uninteresting. Above all, they're not able to take into account the creativity of man. And that's, of course, a theme which comes in very much in the whole of my book as well, but as it were, how far and how much is man able to create, including himself or other people like him and so on. Petrarch is already saying, for example, yes, I don't like the schoolmen. I do like Augustine still, he says, but I want to read him neat and not fed through some, as it were, manualist accounts. And that attitude continued even more strongly, of course, when at the time of printing for the first time, you could read all of Augustine's works. Most of them, almost everything we've still got now. That wasn't possible in the Middle Ages. Then all you did was to read bits and pieces, excerpts. There were some whole works you treated, but it's very difficult with medieval thinkers, for example, to know which Augustine works they had read, apart from the Confession of the City of God and Commentary on Genesis, for example. But these were not necessarily even the most controversial texts. The whole Pelagian arguments in the Middle Ages and later depended on other texts, which very few people had read. Some had, a lot of people hadn't and didn't know what they were about. I remember when I was writing the Augustine Deformed book, I was castigating Anselm for not getting an obvious bit of Augustine's ideas correct. And I suddenly realized, I don't think he's read that particular book. And of course, that was the explanation. So that's what you got. I think it was Eric Sark said somewhere that in the Middle Ages, everybody invents their own Augustine. And of course, that led to not only bizarre things coming out, but in a way, a kind of manualist account of these people, which you can understand that More and Colet and Erasmus, not to speak of Petrarch, just got bored with.
Yeah.
It just looked so inadequate as an account of the world in which we know.
You know, as you say that, I'm struck by a contrast that you mentioned your undergraduate days in the 1950s, and anybody who does Catholic theology will know that that's really the pinnacle, or at least a major point of the Ressource Mall movement, where writers like Gilson and de Lubac and Congar and Chenu were going back to the sources of Catholicism. They were responding against this manualist tradition, which was lifeless, and trying to enrich the Catholic tradition by going back to the original sources. Whereas in the 1960s, with the rise of postmodernism, you get an opposite reaction almost. You almost get a sense that tradition has to be killed, and we need to start to remake truth. You get Foucault, and where things become about power. What do you think? Is there something to that?
Well, there are several things interrelated to what you talked about. First of all, yeah, the Ressourcement was obviously an attempt to return to the sources, especially to the Greek sources. But there were also odd features about that. It was a reaction against Latin in Christianity generally, in many ways, I think. That's the first one. It had a party pre, which wasn't always evident at the time. That is to replace in some ways, the old scholastic tradition by something worked out from, let's say, Gregory of Nyssa or Origen or someone of that kind, without taking too much account of how good these people were in philosophy. As long as they were older and not tied down, let's say, by the Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome tradition, they were better. Well, in some sense, it worked for a while, but it hasn't worked in the long run. You look at all those people you mentioned, one or two of whom which I actually knew, Gilson being one, Danielu being another. They have virtually no successors. Now, you've got to ask yourself why that happened. Now that's the first question I would raise. The second one, of course, I would raise is that although Nietsche and Dostoevsky had analyzed very well what was happening in 19th century Europe, this hadn't sunk into the Catholic tradition at all. It's true that de Lubac did write a book called The Drama of Atheist Humanism, but it was not influential, and certainly people didn't realize what was going to hit the older tradition in the 60s and later. They certainly didn't realize this. And I suppose, again, we're dealing with a bigger problem here. The bigger problem is that essentially since the Counter-Reformation, in many respects, the Catholic Church, which is obviously the main basis for what I call the original tradition, had withdrawn into itself. They hardly took notice of people outside. They didn't realize how important, say, Hume was or Kant. And when they did, the reaction was pretty poor. They were playing catch up, in other words, for a very long period of time. What happened in the 60s was that the catch up was repeated again with new people. They didn't know enough about Nietzsche or Hegel. The immediate reaction in some ways was to do what I suppose you could say Mariam did this sort of thing. They did then what people did in the Transcendental Thomism at the end of the 19th century. They suddenly jumped on the immediate bandwagon without really understanding how seriously different that was from what they really wanted to defend. In other words, they were driven into a position of reconciling the irreconcilable. The same thing's happened now with postmodernism in many ways. Those people are trying to defend traditional values of some kind, which they still respect, but they're trying to do it through tools which people like Nietzsche knew perfectly well were only designed to destroy them, and would indeed succeed in doing so if you took them seriously.
As we're seeing today.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Well, many of those.
There's a great deal of interest in Nietzsche at the moment, and indeed there should be, but for the right reasons. The point about Nietzsche is that he challenged things in such a strong way that if he's right, you can't do much with the bits. You've got to show in some way or other that he's wrong. Now, the same thing, of course, occurs in some other more technical areas. Let's say, for example, the influence of Hume. Most Anglo-American philosophers are some sort of Humeans. And that means they basically accepted Hume's account of what's given in perception, which was accepted by Kant too. Most of them don't know that this thesis of Hume, accepted by Kant, was more or less demolished by Husserl and his school, and that you don't have to rely on those people. But you can see in the way that philosophy is taught, particularly in the Anglo-American world, just how effective all this has become. It still is the case in many places, not obviously Catholic ones, but in many places, that ancient philosophy stops with Aristotle and starts again with Descartes. There's no good reason why that should be the case, except for the general view that some sort of things are not worth discussing anymore. Of course, that doesn't mean that they aren't worth discussing anymore, but that's essentially what's happened. This, of course, not only is undesirable in itself, but it fails completely to enable you to understand where Descartes himself comes from, why he says what he does. It's the same problem now as I was talking about before. If you have a philosopher, you need to know what he's trying to answer. It's no good imposing your own questions on him. What's he trying to answer? Well, one of the things that Descartes was trying to do, extraordinarily enough, was to, having scrapped the scholastic system, was to replace it by some revised account of which he thought of Augustine, which could be combined with contemporary science, the science of Galileo, Copernicus, and so on. It may have been a crazy idea, but that's what he was actually trying to do. And unless you think about that's what he wanted to do, you're not going to be able to get a correct answer as to what he actually did, or rather than what you imagine he did. There are so many examples of this in the history of philosophy. If you take, when I first wrote my original book on Augustine in 1984, one of the reasons I wrote it, as I said in the introduction, was because I got tired of reading books which told me about what Augustine meant to Calvin, or what he meant to somebody in some later period, or even to Aquinas, because I wanted to know what were the questions that Augustine himself wanted to answer. And when I open a book about and find some otherwise reasonable account of one of his works, devoting 2 whole pages to whether Augustine is an ontologist or not, I began to think that people were just not asking the right question at all. You've got to ask, first of all, what questions do they ask themselves? What questions do they want to answer? When you've got that right, you can then raise the further question, is that a sensible question to ask anyway? That's the more strictly philosophical question. But if you do it the other way around, all you do is misinterpret the original author and build some castle of sand, as it were, on top.
Which I personally, in my own background is more history and historical theology than it is philosophy. One thing I've noticed, though, about historical theology and history in general is the influence of theory on historical investigation.
Yes.
And I find that many theorists, there's some really good work in theory, but many attempts to apply theory to the historical past are doing what you're kind of explaining. It's almost a very superficial reading of these ancient authors. They're not really getting into the kinds of questions that they themselves were grappling with.
No, that's right. And of course, that has some very seriously bad effects. I've just written an essay about this in a collection, as a matter of fact. But one of the things you get in this situation, for example, is, let's say someone will tell you that Plato's Sophist is really a primitive version of something you can find in Quine. Of course, a sensible student at that point will say, if that's all it is, I won't bother with the Sophist, I'll just read Quine. Of course, the fact is that you can't start with assuming that what they're trying to answer, even as it were implicitly, is the same question as you're trying to ask. And if you try and explain those difficult, odd things away, what you've done, you're behaving unjustly to the student. Because what you're doing is that you're assuming that the things which are obviously true to you are true to this person. The other bits that are not true to you are just errors. Yeah. But of course, the really exciting thing is to see whether when they do say something which sounds bizarre, what reasons they have things just off the top of their head that they may seem stupid to us, but they had probably good reasons for actually saying them. That's what we want to know. And if you can find out what they are, it could be even that will enrich your own world. You'll find, yeah, well, some of this is on the right lines after all. And perhaps I should try and build that into what I'm doing in my own work. That way you can really learn from the past rather than simply turning it into the present.
You one of the things that you say gets imported into these questions of the human person is the concept of empathy. Somewhere in like the early
empathy, yes.
Empathy in the early modern period. And when you say in the early modern period, it's almost as if empathy is introduced for the worse. But then with Edith Stein, she has more of a healthier understanding of empathy and how we can think about other people's experiences. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think empathy in the 18th century is important. They may have misused it, but it's a really important addition to the philosophical bag, as it were. And I, in the book, I associated both the use of empathy in the philosophers, starting with Shaftesbury and then going on to Hume, Hutchinson, and so on, and also to the novels of Richardson, in which you get these very different kind of characters from what one's normally found in literature before. That's really important. Diderot recognized this when he wrote a work in praise of Richardson's novels, which were enormously popular in France, incidentally, and influenced Rousseau very considerably, though he had a more sophisticated attitude to them. It's talking about the ordinary person, not the exceptional individual. Not the hero of a Greek tragedy or the sort of aristocrat of Renaissance writings of various kinds, the courtier or whatever. It's just ordinary people, interestingly enough, particularly usually women in the 18th century, as in Richardson, for example. They're ordinary feelings, which the person who reads this, a quite ordinary person who reads them, and these works were immensely popular, incidentally. The ordinary person who reads them can, as it were, put themselves, as I said, into the shoes of the characters. You can hardly really imagine yourself being like Oedipus or Achilles, but it's not difficult to be like Clarissa or Pamela. Of course, the thing was open to abuse, and some of the harsher critics in the 18th century themselves said that this was just an excuse for sort of peddling sentimentality and hypocrisy, which of course was in huge measure in the 18th century. Fielding, of course, wrote this work called Shamala, which is a satire on Pamela, indicating that Pamela is simply a sentimental fraud, an attempt to deceive the public by over-emotionalism and so on. But nevertheless, despite that, this is an important thing in moral philosophy. It is important to be able to try and experience what somebody else is experiencing if you're going to understand or even advise them what to do. I mean, if you're a preacher, for example, if you can't understand the way that the person you're talking to is feeling, not necessarily even thinking, but feeling, you're not going to have much chance of getting into touch with them, trying to find where they are, where you may want them to go, and so on. You just talk over them and they think, oh, it's just the usual old claptrap and so on, and just go down to the bar. So it is an important point, and although it was, as I say, overemphasized in the 18th century by Hutchinson and people like that, it was important that, and by the time we get round to Edith Stein, she knows a lot about it because partly I emphasize her practical role here. She'd been a nurse, a military nurse in World War I, and she knew a lot about people dying and what it was, and tried to find some way of consoling them. And of course, you don't console someone if you haven't any idea of what they're feeling. You've got to get somehow inside them to do that effectively. And so, when she began to talk about this and debate about the attitude you take, for example, towards death compared with the attitude taken, let's say, by Heidegger, yes, a great deal can be learned in that kind of way, and that can be added very much to the individual, to the original tradition. And in particular, of course, when you're talking about individual feelings like this, everyone is going to be rather different. You can't just bracket people in some statistical way and say 55% of the people feel scared at X or Y or something like that. What you want to know is whether this person falls into the 55%. Augustine emphasized that, of course, way back when he points out what his own vices were, and they were different from those of his friend Alypius. That's an important point. It's no good just talking in abstract terms about what people ought to live like, what they ought to do, or something like that. You need to be able to know, as it were, in each case, if you're going to be effective, as it were, where this person is starting on the spectrum, so to speak. And the ability to sympathize or empathize with somebody or other is a very good way of beginning to do that. You can begin to understand then individual differences. And it's no accident, of course, that Edith Stein was not only interested in empathy, but she was also interested in the fact that she thought that the traditional metaphysics deriving from Aquinas and so on didn't put anything like enough emphasis on the individual differences between human beings. That you could distinguish, I think I said in the book, between you could only distinguish a whole bunch of people as members of the human race. You couldn't distinguish what the difference between Jack and James is, let alone Jack and Jill, which she, of course, was rather wanting to emphasize.
Well, I think this is incredibly relevant for today because, you know, as you point out in one of your chapters on virtue signaling and propaganda, the term empathy almost gets used as a cudgel today, and to signal somebody's virtue, like what celebrities do. But what they do in so doing is, as you say, they lump people into groups. So all Black people think or feel this way, all women feel this way, all white people feel this way.
That's right. Yeah.
And you point out the fact that if there's anything racist in the world, that's probably it. And I was trying to find a passage in here. I thought I marked it, but I can't find it. But as I was reading your book, I was watching an interview on YouTube, and it was a couple of guys in the UK interviewing a former member of the Labour Party, and I can't remember his name. If I could find the passage, I figured out his name. And he was making this exact same point that you're making, which I found quite providential in some respects. You know, he was a Black man, and he says he gets sick and tired of people thinking that he can speak and think for all Black males, as if all Black males are the same. And that's one of the problems that emerges when we're trying to grapple with the relationship between the unique individual, but also the collective community.
When I was in Washington, it was a Kenyan Black, and he would often say, white people think that Blacks are all the same. I'm not from Nigeria. He was from Kenya, of course. That made a lot of difference. Yeah. That sort of thing is odd enough. What becomes really sinister in this situation is where these groups are encouraged to feel that they're all victims. Now, this is a feature of modern life, which is constantly played on. It's a post-Marxist idea. Obviously, Marx and particularly Engels, I suppose more, wanted to say that the proletarians, the working class, and the peasants were victims, which in many ways, of course, they were. But of course, you can call yourself a victim when you aren't a victim at all. You can identify some group rather as being victims, and these people encourage them to think of themselves as victims. But that's merely misleading them in many cases. They're not victims at all, or most of them are not. Some of them may be, but individually, quite as large a number of them are probably not victims. I think a lot of women feel like this. As a matter of fact, they just don't identify with the notion that they're necessarily victims now. They will say, well, yes, in the past there were serious problems and so on and so forth, but most of the serious problems have now been, in our society at least, more or less resolved. And it's quite ridiculous to behave as though we were in a much worse off situation than people were in the beginning of the 18th and the 19th century. so that the use of these groups, mass groups, and then attaching victimhood to them, in fact, is guaranteed to do nothing more than to cause trouble in society, to cause violence, and so on and so forth. I think most people who start hurling words like racist around are actually encouraging racism in our society. Not always, but there's a very common tendency for this to happen. And similarly with other throwaway words, you can almost be honored if you get described by one of them in some way or another. One's tempted to do it, they play the other game round, to call all these people Christophobic. But I mean, that wouldn't go down quite so well.
No. You bring up the United Nations, and you in so doing, you bring this discussion into the realm of public policy and laws and human rights. Are you familiar with the work of Thomas Sowell?
Not very much, no.
Because he makes points about the same issue that are very similar to yours. Because when we start to talk about human rights, as you bring up, all kinds of problems emerge when it gets combined with this group identity politics. Can you say a few things about that? Because it's really important to your book on how we talk about the human person.
Yes.
So there's a shift that happens when we stop talking about virtue and morality and we start talking about human rights.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly prepared to defend some human rights. Yeah, the problem is that if you go away from the original, what I call the original tradition, you have no really useful way, except convenience or power or something like that, to determine which rights are actually legitimately claimed. Mm-hmm. In the old days, you could. I mean, obviously earlier on, people talked not about rights but about dignity, and there's a real difference between those two things. Yeah. You can claim a right which will be entirely out of keeping with dignity. For example, someone might claim the right to be a prostitute, but that doesn't mean that they're claiming to be more dignified, and they certainly wouldn't be made more dignified if they took up that activity. Yeah. In the old days, to some extent, well, people originally assumed, well, we know what rights are. It's the right to life, right not to be tortured, right not to be imprisoned unjustly by church or state. So these things seem so obvious, and most people would realize that was a threat. But now we've got the situation that any group can call on any right they like, and you can say you've got to answer. Whereas there was always a question of the clash of rights, now it's absolutely endemic. Almost any new right you claim will clash with other rights that are already on the table. How do you determine them? Well, my view is that if you get outside the original tradition, essentially, you can't determine them at all. It then just becomes a mere power play. The right that wins is the one that has got the big guns on its side.
I found a quote that I'm looking for, not the one I was looking for before, but there's a beautiful quote you have on this very issue. And I'm going to ask you a question about it, okay? I'm going to read on page 219. Quote, "The mainline tradition correctly holds dignity to be more basic than rights. And in all cases where it can reasonably be argued that someone's rights have been infringed, it can be pointed out that rights claims can be rephrased in terms of dignity, whereas not all infringements on human dignity can be intelligibly considered infringements on human rights.
Yes.
Rights infringement depends on the improper activity of another person, and yes, another person, I emphasize, since only persons as moral agents can infringe on human rights. Thus, to be able to act immorally as well as morally is a mark of an albeit inadequately developed human being or person." Now the question, because you bring this up, the ever-expanding notion of human rights ultimately leads, you say, to totalitarianism.
Points towards it, yes.
Points towards it, yes. I guess it doesn't inevitably lead, but it points towards it.
Yes.
And you're suggesting, this is one of the main, I think, one of the most important contributions of your book, is that if we return to talking about human dignity rather than human rights, we can potentially avoid that pitfall.
You made it entirely better to avoid it, but as I said just now, it does give you some sort of standard by which you can determine what is a reasonably claimed right. Mm-hmm. it's very hard to, if you don't have anything like that, it's very hard to know why you can disqualify almost anything. I seem to remember when I was teaching in Toronto, I once had an ethics class to write on the subject, which was the heading in a student newspaper, which the heading ran, "Every student's got the right to get drunk." So I asked them to write an essay on that as to whether they agreed with it and for what reason they could give, and so on and so forth. It was interesting because, of course, in many cases, these were not the brightest students by any means, and they were by no means always philosophy students. They were rather a mixed class. In general, it was a very revealing essay to set, because it seemed that many of them thought the only reasons why you wouldn't have a right to get drunk, and I emphasize the word right here, was that you might get into a car and kill somebody, or B, you might get AIDS. Other than that, there seemed to be no other reason why every student shouldn't have the right to get drunk. Well, I mean, that's a pretty low-level defense of the right to get drunk, but it's not that different from what the sort of thing you normally hear in more serious and indeed probably in a way reasonable claims. For example, let's say every human being's got a right to have a good diet, for example, which of course deals with needs rather than wants. That's an important distinction, incidentally, here, which I didn't say much about in the book, but I'm going to say something about it in a new writing I'm working on now with my wife. Plato makes a distinction in the Republic between necessary and unnecessary desires, and that's a very important distinction. Necessary desires he picks out as food and shelter, basically. Unnecessary ones are pitiful everything else, though some of them are less harmful and indeed are useful but not essential. For example, marriage, let's say, would be one of those. But most people, when they talk about rights, they don't only talk about needs, they talk about what I want to have. So a very large number of rights claims are little more than reified desires. So if we're trying to sort them out, that's the first thing you've got to get rid of. Let's get rid of all those which are merely reified desires. Unless they can establish themselves at least as a legitimate need for something, that you've already started to reduce the package, as it were, and stop this wild proliferation of unreasonable and merely power-driven claims. I mean, when I talk about power here, I think this is what really worries me and what's happening in the contemporary university at the moment, actually. What's going on a great deal of the time is that instead of talking about what's the right answer to a question, you start talking about how can we get what we want? How do we manipulate the society in such a way that we've got the power and these other bastards haven't got any, as it were? That's obviously an interesting question of political theory, if you like. It's not a question of philosophy. Philosophers would be merely interested in identifying those two questions were different.
Yeah. You know, one of the hot button issues you address in your book, which gets to the point you're making, is abortion, and you say that you bring it up with the claim to reproductive rights. Would that qualify as one of these? How did you describe it? How did you just put that, the distinction that Plato makes between different desires?
Well, most of the arguments about abortion on behalf that the arguments for pro-abortionists are simply, I don't want this child, or I don't want that. They won't use the word child unless they actually do want it. When you use it, when you want the child, you call it a child. When you don't want it, you call it something else. But that's yes. In that case, this is just an argument from desire. I just don't want this. That's of course tied to the notion, it's tied to the notion about who's responsible for what. And that introduces another theme which is quite important in the book, actually. That is this question of whether we are serial selves or not. That goes back obviously to Locke and Hume and recently Derek Parfit and people like that. It is an important question, particularly in the view of the fact that we're all living longer. It seems in some ways, we're more and more remote from what we were when we were young. Therefore, the argument might want to go, we get more and more different from the people when we go, therefore we are no longer responsible for what we did so many years ago.
Yes.
But again, when this is done, it's a pretty. These are pretty arbitrary selections as to what you do. For example, if Karl was a concentration camp guard or even commandant, got away for 40 years, and we suddenly discovered that he was around. Not too many people probably want to say, well, he wasn't the same person now, particularly if he's never repented or given a word of repentance for doing anything like that. So it's convenient at that time to get rid of Karl, as it were, or Klaus, whatever it's going to be called. But in other cases, say you want to get a divorce, it's much more convenient to say, well, I'm not the same person who was married X then, and she's not the same person who's married me, so therefore we're not married at all anyway. So the state may as well legalize that. Again, it's a matter of being just thinking through the thing a bit. There are refined desires and acting according with them do have curious entailments. Obviously, the abortion case that you raised, I was particularly interested because I can see no reason really to deny the personhood of the individual when conceived. There seems to be no other rational way to split them up, as it were, as they go on developing. So that what people claim who want to argue for abortion is, well, my right to kill is more important than this person's right to live. And if you put it in that kind of terms, well, as I say, how do you resolve that? Well, you do it by getting a motion through the UN Council or something of the sort, or through some legislature or something like that, where politicians don't want to say what they really believe, but only what they think will get them elected. Once you start thinking along those kind of lines, you begin to realize that what seems a purely moral issue has huge political ramifications as well. And some of them throw serious rocks, as it were, in the direction of what we assume to be the perfect features of our current democracy.
Yeah. You're right. One of the central insights of your book is the shift that occurs. You sort of point it to Duns Scotus, but it really kind of manifests later with Locke, perhaps, or Descartes. The shift from talking about the soul or the human person as a composite to the mind. You get the psychological development where consciousness is really the defining feature of what it is to be a person. And that can lead, as you point out in your book, to all kinds of atrocities. If you're going to define the human person by consciousnness, well, what does that do to people with Down syndrome?
Well, it means they can often be eliminated. That's the implication.
Precisely.
That's one of the dangerous risks that I'm always pointing to, of course. If I went out into the street, was knocked down by a bus and went into a coma, I would on this theory, I could quite easily tend to be euthanized.
That's right.
I'm not a person anymore. There are obviously public policy implications for any of these apparently simple moral issues, as it were. That they don't just remain at the personal level. Anybody who says these are just personal decisions is talking nonsense. They have huge ramifications in social structure and indeed political structures as well. They may cause you X to be elected, and then why not to be elected?
Yeah. Well, I think you bring this up in your book, if I'm not mistaken, but that can apply to people who are sleeping. Right. So if you're sleeping, you're not fully conscious. So does that mean that somebody can decide that you don't deserve to exist? And
it raises the question: if someone stabs you in the back when they're asleep, did they really murder you?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So this I think is a great way to segue back to the mainline tradition. And here you talk about Tertullian, and his concept or his application of the term persona or prosopon in Greek, and Augustine. And of course, you link this to their metaphysical questions about the human person. Can you talk a little bit about that? What can they teach us today?
Well, as you indicated a while ago, my view is that the more you diverge from what I call the original tradition, the more you are developing something which could be called a totalitarian mindset, particularly represented by the phenomenon of being homogenized.
Yes.
Obviously, groups of people who are sets of victims are already homogenized. They're not distinct. We're just victims, just like they are the proletariat are just victims according to classical Marxism. Somebody said about in 1917. The Lenins and Trotskys of this world have no concern for the individual. That's absolutely correct, I think. It doesn't really matter. As long as you get your end result and it seems to look better, as it were, but you paid a very high price, it may not really be better at all, even for those that do survive. This is pointing, the more you homogenize, the more you are liable to encourage a totalitarian mentality. And that doesn't have to be imposed by force, of course. It can be imposed by fraud or by propaganda, whichever way you're going to call it.
Nazi Germany.
Sorry?
Nazi Germany.
Well, they actually, there was a technical term there, I think, wasn't there? Gleichschaltung means homogenizing, that you should all be units of the same kind. In the army, simply killing machines or something like that. In the ordinary public, well, but people just obey orders. The interesting thing is, you see, that the orders don't have to be given by an obvious dictator. You may not know who is actually giving the orders. It could be public opinion, peer pressure, or whatever. But these are real orders. I mean, teenagers commit suicide because of peer pressure. They don't know whether, who's actually given the order that you must be like this. It's just they know that you must be like this, as it were. And if you don't, you somehow don't belong to the human race, and you may commit suicide, as indeed a number do. People talk about the danger of this. They see the problem. My view is that they're not willing to look deep enough as to why this has happened and what ways of stopping it, rather than merely, as it were, sticking band-aids on it and solving some little bit of the problem. It'll just come up again somewhere else without any real solution, because they don't want to face the real questions. Abortion is one of these. People don't want to face the question that, can we kill human beings for convenience or not? Now, that's a totalitarian question, of course. Totalitarians do kill for convenience. When you move, as someone like Biden does, for example, talking about killing the unborn to killing the young people, infanticide, you've already moved way beyond, as it were, perhaps specialist definitions of the person to views of the person which virtually everybody actually holds. Hardly anybody would say that a newborn child isn't a person. And yet, it's 20 years ago now. I can remember hearing a doctor say in Toronto, if only people would get over their hang-ups about infanticide, we'd have no problem with abortion. That's a long while ago. But that now, I mean, that wasn't happening then. What you notice is that the goalposts have been moved. Each time that a social move is made and some diminution of human value, human individuality is removed, you've gone one stage further, and then you can go one stage further still next time. This is a real threat to anybody who tries to teach moral behavior, whether civically or religiously. If you take the view that here is a good proposal, here is a bad one, we've got to go in between the two and try and satisfy both. What you mean is you've given a further advantage to the person who holds the bad view. The next time, he can go on further and further and further. This is a kind of salami tactic method for changing society without violence, as it were. And it's happening all the time. We discuss things now about, particularly in bioethics, which no one would have talked about 40 years ago. I don't say they're not real questions, they are, but they've been put on the table because of this process of gradual shifting the goalposts around, and particularly because of the efforts of politicians, whether at the public level or more, let's say, at the private level. I mean, I first became aware of this phenomenon, this spaghetti system, as it were, when I was in Toronto, when I was chairman of the University Faculty Association, when it was one of my colleagues in the history department, a man called Bill Nelson, coined what he called Nelson's Law. And Nelson's law was that if the administration was confronted with an honorable and seriously intellectual policy on the one hand, and a dishonorable and anti-intellectual policy on the other, they will go in between the two. And if you go in between the two, of course, the full-blooded intellectual policy has gone. You're now going down the road further and further in the same direction. Happily, in the 60s, that was more or less stopped. But of course, it's now come up again. And the attack on intellectual life in universities is now starting again in our universities too, as you can see all over the place.
Yeah. You know,
as you said before, I probably wouldn't get a job these days, as it were. I was able to tell my students when I was teaching in Washington, I'm not a permanent member of the faculty here. I don't care what you write on your reports about me. I'm going to tell you what I think, and did. It didn't go down badly, as a matter of fact. I think, as was common when teaching in a largely atheist philosophy department in Toronto. If you're not an atheist and don't pretend to be, that you can be respected even if you're not liked. If you just try and go along, all you do is just regarded as a creep.
Oh yeah, you know, the sad thing is, in my take, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but so many of the ideas that are poisoning society today that you've kind of talked about come from universities.
Well, yes.
And you know, a lot of people blame Nietsche. I think you would probably disagree with that to some degree, but certainly the Frankfurt School and critical theory has a role to play. But it's just devastating how this totalitarian mentality is coming from places that are supposed to be homes to intellectual diversity and the pursuit of knowledge.
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously, the intellectual integrity has always been under threat in different ways and under different regimes, as of course Socrates realized right at the beginning. The difficulty now, though, of course, is that universities are not simply just little places like Plato's Academy run, as it were, out of the back pocket of individuals. They are big political instruments with huge political power. So they're exposed to political manipulation and therefore to the desire of politicians to be popular in a way that they have hardly ever been in the past. A politician, in many cases, dare not say a lot of things he really, really wants to say anymore in a democracy. Mm-hmm. And if you've got to be trained to be like that, you've got to learn it in the university in some sense. You've got to learn, as I said when I was addressing the American Philosophical Association when they gave me their award, you've got to learn to be a sophist rather than a philosopher. You've got to learn to rationalize rather than to think. Mm-hmm. Intelligent people, of course, are better at rationalizing than other people. Yeah. And so they will get on well in university departments and so on and so forth. It's always been a problem, but now it's become such a big political problem and so many millions of pounds or dollars are wrapped up in it that it's become very much more difficult to stop.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the criticisms that I often hear from people on the left of the political spectrum who tend to agree with ideas of egalitarianism, collectivism, is that conservatives like myself are individualists. You know, we focus so much on the individual that we lose sight of the collective. But I think your book makes the important point that if we start asking questions about the human person from the idea that the human person is made in the image of God, that actually informs not just understanding of the person as person, but it informs morality and social obligations, which I think is what early Christianity really understood. They weren't just a collection of individuals. They were members of communities that had social obligations stemming from Genesis 1:26.
Yes. People who don't like the kind of views that I hold often try and make out that I would be some kind of libertarian or something of that kind. That I'm only interested in certain issues, not interested in the poor, for example, anything like that, the ordinary dispossessed. This is just a bit of black propaganda, basically. I mean, there are people like that. There are people who, as it were, are very much concerned about the unborn and don't give a damn about people dying of starvation in some city street. I don't regard myself as one of them, and I don't think that's a logical position. In fact, I regard myself in some sense as a socialist, certainly not a liberal, but in some sense as a socialist in this regard. That is, I think that individual morality is necessarily tied to social responsibility.
Yeah.
Now,
I think we lost him again.
the good example of this sort of an arrangement between two individuals, no longer between two families that it used to be once, but between two individuals. And of course, it is that. But that's not the whole story. One of the points about marriage and one of the reasons why it should be an institution in society is because what these two individuals do affects the whole society. It affects the next generation, how many there are, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the notion that it is just a question of individuals, it doesn't relate at all to the society. They're not interested or shouldn't be interested in that. This tends to be a complete mistake and a dangerous mistake, in fact. But I think most people now don't understand this. Yeah. Most people think that marriage, for example, is just a matter of two people agreeing to get married. It is that, as I say, but it's also people wanting to do something, wanting to take an action which will affect the community around them, whether it works or whether it doesn't. In ancient times, people talked about producing children for the city.
Yep.
They weren't, of course, it wasn't only for the city, but it was also for the city, as it were. And indeed, it's impossible for individuals to live outside the city. They may pretend they do, but they rely on the city all the time. Therefore, they need to contribute to it, if for no other reason than that. As it were, contrast individualism, public interest, as it were, is a bogus contrast. You need both of those things together, neither one nor the other. So in that sense, I would regard myself as being, so to speak, in political terms, neither really on the left nor really on the right. I'm trying to get the strengths of each side in the middle. When I began to teach in Toronto in 1960, I was way to the left of my students. By 1968, I was apparently way to the quote right. I don't think I'd changed my views at all during that period. I have since, but not then. The mood in the society changes, but the individual doesn't have to change. But the issues remain the same. And as I say, it's a useful propaganda tool to make out that people who, for example, are anti-abortion are, as it were, unconcerned with other social factors. In my case, at least, and for many others, that just isn't true. It's a simple lie, and it should be labeled as such.
You know, you talk about the family as an institution, and I think that is so vitally important. The notion of institutions and the role they play in society. Black Lives Matter, of course, which has gained a lot of momentum since this summer. One of their tenets is to demolish or abolish the nuclear family as a Western kind of white supremacist concept, which is so sad because one of the things that we know that there's all kinds of empirical evidence to support this. One of the biggest predictors of future poverty is children raised in single parent families.
That's right.
So if you want to ruin society, start by abolishing the family.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I mean, I regard Black Lives Matter as basically as an anarchist organization. It has a coloring of concern with race, but it's not. In that connection, I would remind you of the famous remark I've quoted more than once. I may have mentioned it in this book, actually. When Goering was brought to trial in Nuremberg before he committed suicide, he said, I didn't join the Nazi party because of all the racial nonsense. I joined because I was a revolutionary.
Yeah.
And that was Goering is in many ways an intelligent and honest man. That is a true statement. And if you read Dostoevsky's novels, for example, you'll find people just like that in those novels, particularly Peter Verhovensky in The Devils. And they're derived again from actual people that Dostoevsky knew. Members of groups like People's Will, for example, in 1860s Russia. These people are basically anarchists, dressing up anarchism with some locally popular cause, which can draw massive support, which they will not get any other way. So they're simply tricksters in this regard and should be exposed as such.
Yeah. No, 100% right. Well, we've been on for a little bit more than an hour. How do you feel? Do you feel like we can continue, or
Oh, I hadn't noticed how long I'd been on, but you'll get fed up with me after a while.
It's been such a wonderful conversation. I don't really want to stop because it's so important. I think. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you've got any more specific questions, I'm quite willing to take a few more.
Let me see here. I think there were a couple of them. Oh, yes. Okay. You mentioned, you make this point a couple of times, is that one of the major errors of those who reject the mainline tradition, so the Judeo-Christian Greek philosophical tradition, is that they abandon the notion of original sin.
Yes.
That would make a lot of postmoderns skin crawl, but I love it. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
When I was a student, I was an agnostic. And I used to say the only thing the Christians ever got right was the doctrine of original sin. I certainly still think they got that right, but not, of course, only that now. Yes, I think the doctrine of original sin, in one sense, is an empirical doctrine. You can give it a theological backing if you like, but the proof of the doctrine of original sin is simply looking at history.
Yeah.
And particularly, whereas, for example, if you were in a comfortable middle class, whatever, in England or America in the late 19th century, you might be excused for not thinking that human beings were pretty well perfectible. In the 20th century, no one has got any excuse to think that. It's not only people like Hitler and Stalin and Lenin and Mao and Pol Pot and all the rest of them. It's the people who go along with them, the people who are afraid to talk, the 13 million who voted for Hitler in 1933, without even having to join the Nazi party, for that matter. The doctrine of original sin simply states that human beings are capable of being very bad indeed. It doesn't say that's all they're capable of being, of course, but it does say that. A great deal of modern discussion about this sort of thing, particularly if you go back into the utilitarian tradition, it's very strong in, say, in Bentham already, is that human beings can really, by their own effort, be perfected. And I mean perfected in a strong sense. You've only got to build enough schools, make enough contraceptives, build enough hospitals or whatever, and you'll get a perfect race. This strikes me as absolute rubbish. And that the doctrine of original sin is the explanation of that phenomenon. In other words, human beings, somehow or other, as we've developed or evolved or whatever word you're going to use, we've got this, what McIntyre calls third factor in us, which means that we're liable to do crazy, unpleasant things very often, both deliberately and unconsciously, a large number of times. I don't think any honest person who's thought about their own life can really deny this, but they do.
Yeah. You talk about the utilitarians and their fundamental principle that we should do the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. And the doctrine of original sin would seem to retort by saying, that's not even possible.
Well, I think it is impossible. How can you possibly engage in any such thing? All you can do is to do within the sphere in which you live what good you can do. And that's all you need to bother about. You may be called upon to do some wider thing. The Stoics had a doctrine which they called oikeiosis, in which they talked about as it were, receding levels of responsibility as they move away from the individual, the family, the city, the wider community. In a few cases, let's say like a Roman emperor, maybe like Marcus Aurelius, it might in fact involve large numbers of the occupants of the planet. But you don't calculate to be in that position, and you aren't in that position. You just can't do that. It's a chimera. It's a false model in which to think of how to behave, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work partly because you're always faced with the question. This sort of question, if I was running a lifeboat and the two people were in the water, one of them was my son or daughter and the other was Hitler, which one would I pick up? I mean, I couldn't just debate endlessly which one it would be, because which would give you the greatest advance for humanity. I'd do the obvious thing and pick up my son or daughter. that's how it works in practice. That's real existence. What I'm talking about here, in other words, is that there's a tendency in philosophy to move away from reality altogether. And this is particularly true, I think, in modern life, both in modern universities and in modern politics, for that matter, too. You become a full-time academic for life, as it were, when you start as an undergraduate. You become a full-time politician. As soon as you finish doing university, you go into some of these private office, then you get a seat and so on and so forth. You live in a kind of bubble all the time, and you're not conscious, unless you make the real effort to be, of the sort of lives that other people who are not like you are actually living. And this is, again, a matter of empathy. We've come back to that. It's easy in that ideal world, in that ivory tower, to come up with some notion like Bentham's that, oh yes, we obviously we all want the greatest good of the greatest number. But if you think about what that means, you realize it just doesn't add up. We just can't do that.
Yeah, and it seems to me that people like Edmund Burke, for example, were responding in their political philosophy against that notion, because when that concept of doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people influences public policy, I think, as you state in your book, or at least we can conclude from it anyway, that you're ultimately going to infringe upon the rights of others. And Burke would say something to the effect of, that's why we shouldn't have an all-powerful government that manages every aspect of life, which tries to
Burke is an interesting figure because he was a Whig politician. Yep. That is, he was on the whole, so to speak, as we would say, on the liberal side of things. But when it came to the French Revolution, reality kicked in. Most of his colleagues, Fox and the others, were strongly in favor of the French Revolution, and you could see why they would be. But Burke did not follow them. He plowed his own furrow at that point. He realized, and as he puts it in his reflections on the French Revolution, he's always talking about not the rights of man, capital M, but the rights of men. He makes that distinct. He writes in that kind of way. He's not talking about the abstraction humanity. Yeah. Humanity is something you tend to kill people for. The rights of individual men, I think you try and look after individuals in some way or another. And Burke is very impressive in this regard because it was in some ways contrary to his own political tradition. He was able to see beyond his immediate and earlier political goals in recognizing that you can't just talk about humanity. You've got to talk about individual men. It should be to you. The revolutions in France should not have been talking about man, but about the individual Frenchman and so on.
Yeah, I referenced Thomas Sowell earlier, who's had a profound impact on me the last several months. But he complains about people who view people in the abstract. And he says there are no people in the abstract. There are individuals that we have to pay attention to, but there are no people in the abstract, which I think is the point you're making about Burke.
Well, in that case, I always quote Aristotle's line about this. Man, capital M, that is, as it were, is the father of man. But Peleus is the father, but there is no such thing. But Peleus is the father of Achilles, and your father is the father of you. And that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
The man is merely a convenient noun for talking about a group of individuals who have common characteristics, but also individual ones, but sufficiently common ones that they can put together into a set, as it were. In that sense, they can be measured statistically and quantitatively. But within that set, of course, they have colossal differences of quality in every possible way. You remember in Dante's Paradiso, they don't all live in the same level.
And just to kind of sum up here, I think when we talk about the person, when we talk about human dignity, I think we have to remember, as you so rightly point out, that each individual is made in the image of God. It's not man as an abstract concept, which is so important if we want to remember that people with Down syndrome, the fertilized embryo at the moment of conception, are both individual human beings with intrinsic dignity.
Well, yes, I mean that's exactly what they are. they're not, as people want to say, potential persons.
Yeah.
They're persons with potential. Just as way the rest of us are. I mean, you grow both before you're born and after you're born, and hopefully, eventually you grow in a more moral sense. You can't do too much of that before birth, but you've got to get to the state where you're able to do it. Yeah. But it's the same you that's doing it. It isn't somebody else. You haven't suddenly taken the thing away and put somebody else in their place. It's individual in that sense. Edith Stein, it seems to me, he was particularly good about this, though she slightly hesitated, I think, as I rather implied, in what she thought about what the universal man actually is. And she wanted to emphasize the individual differences, but she didn't go, I think, to the stage that I think she probably should have gone, the way that Aristotle does in that quote I gave, namely, man is the father of man, but there is no such thing. That man, in that sense, is a concept. When you're talking about original sin, we go back to that. What the distinction between original sin and personal sin is quite simply this: original sin relates to the condition in which you're born, which is a defective condition in various ways. For whatever reason, I have no idea why it happened and so on, but that's the fact of it. As distinct from personal sins, which are what you do with that condition once you've got it. But of course, the condition is actually there. That's what human beings are like, as it were. So once again, what I'm talking about is, in general, it's no good talking in the abstract. You've got to look at people as they actually are, as it were, warts and all. I guess it was Cromwell put it like that. But that's the way you've got to do it. And anything else is indulging in fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I can't think of a better way to end this wonderful conversation. Dr. Rist, thank you so very much. I have really enjoyed this talk. I hope you have too, and I hope our guests have.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope other people have too.
Okay, I'll stop and then we can chat for a little bit.
Well,